Live from the Sirius XM POTUS studios in Washington, D.C., this is the Midday Briefing.
Welcome back to the Midday Briefing on POTUS, Sirius XM 124. I am Tim Farley, and I already mentioned the shows. I should say also tonight, don't forget 6 to 9 p.m. Don't want to make it too long. The Steel and Hunger broadcast here on POTUS. That is your broadcast day.
We're going to need governors who stand up with a steel backbone and push back on health care bills that would ruin our state, tax plans that would ruin our state, and stand up on behalf of dreamers and immigrants. So if we need to be a sanctuary state, that's what we'll be. We need governors who have a steel backbone and say, Mr. President or Attorney General Sessions, you will not do that in the great state of New Jersey.
There's been discussion about pulling the rug out from people that have insurance in New Jersey that rely on that insurance. So back in a couple of years ago when we agreed to the waiver, we signed up 530,000 more people to the Affordable Care Act.
Right.
We can't pull the rug out from underneath them.
That is Kim Guadagno, who is the Republican for New Jersey governor in New Jersey, and obviously in her Democratic opponent, Phil Murphy. He is running for governor in New Jersey. An interesting look at an important election because Chris Christie has about the lowest approval ratings in the country, but that doesn't mean that necessarily the issues are just about Governor Christie. As a matter of fact, it may be that the national scene is playing into this. We want to talk about it with our next guest. Steve Adubato is an Emmy Award-winning broadcaster. The PBS flagship network station is WNET in New York, and he's also the author of a book called Lessons in Leadership. He has an upcoming special, New Jersey's Next Governor, with Steve Adubato, where he has full interviews with both of those candidates. He's tweeting at Steve Adubato and joins us now. Steve, welcome. Thanks for being on the show today.
Tim, it's my honor and pleasure, and I've been enjoying the show for a long time. Great to be with you.
Well, I appreciate that. So let's talk about this. We've got, this seems to be a slam dunk for the Democrats. I mean, Chris Christie's got low approval ratings. President Trump has obviously had an effect on things. It was not a good state for him. On the other hand, one wonders, is this going to be enough? Is this going to be about the two individuals or something larger? What's your take, and what did you learn? And take us through some of the things you found out during your interviews with the two.
Well, first of all, it looks like, it appears as if it should be a Democratic win. I mean, that's usually what New Jersey does after a certain number of years of Republican governor. It is a blue state, a very blue state. But the reality is it's always more complicated than that, Tim. So my view is Trump really, in so many ways, the ACA, the Affordable Care Act issue, the DACA stuff, the NFL stuff with the national anthem, there could be something that happens that is a national, emotional trigger point for voters in New Jersey that could potentially turn this race around. But it is Phil Murphy's to win. Kim Guadagno is tied to Chris Christie. That's good in some ways, bad in more ways. She has a long road to go, but this race is far from over.
Yeah, she can't obviously dissociate herself from him because she was his lieutenant governor and has been and still is. Phil Murphy, what does he bring to the table in terms of associations? Well,
he's a former ambassador to Germany. He gave big money to Democrats. He has supported many other candidates who've run for major office nationally and in the state of New Jersey. He's got the Goldman Sachs thing around him, Tim. It's a funny thing. The former governor of New Jersey, who was disgraced and really left office in huge embarrassment, John Corzine.
Yeah.
Had the same pedigree. But I would argue that Murphy has a more engaging personality, is more connected to people. But Kim Guadagno, very engaging and interesting as well. But she's trying to say, don't blame me for anything you don't like Chris Christie for, but the jobs that were created, give me that credit. But the downgrades, the 10 downgrades, bond ratings, that was under the Christie-Guadagno administration. That is all Murphy is talking about, all Kim Guadagno was talking about, the lieutenant governor, is taxes, taxes, taxes. Phil Murphy, she says, wants to tax people out of New Jersey. It's a question of where people are right about at that time when people are voting emotionally.
Yeah, you brought up a great point. I talked to one of the candidates for the state senate. This is Vin Gopal, and one of the things he talked about was taxes. And I said, well, New Jersey's about I think the most recent rating was about the 5th highest taxing state in the country. But understanding what Governor Christie did, but there was also a Democratic legislature, right? Because he's talking about now, if he wins and unseats his Republican opponent, the incumbent, then they get to a supermajority in the Senate, and you've got a balanced budget. So, and he also said, kind of interestingly, I didn't realize this, but the revenues in the state had risen about $7 billion from $29 to $36 billion since Governor Christie took over. So this can't just be about cutting taxes and what they've cut. Maybe it's much more simple than I'm making it.
No, Tim, you're making it as complicated as it is, frankly. And Vin is running, happens to be, to nationalize this thing for folks. That's a district down at the Jersey Shore that Trump did well in. But there is there's a Republican there, a senator by the name of Jen Beck, who's moderate, who has been against Trump on a whole range of things, particularly his disgraceful comments about women over the years. So it's a D and an R race, but it's not a conservative liberal race. When it comes to taxes, here's the challenge for Murphy. He is very close to the public employee unions. They are very much supporting him. So there's a pension crisis in New Jersey where we get like $50, $60, $70 billion in the hole in terms of public employee pensions. Guadagno's saying, stop telling public employees you're going to be able to pay their pensions. We're not going to be able to. When I asked Murphy about it, he said, okay, we're going to tax millionaires. Then I pressed him and said, okay, what about if they leave? He said, basically, I don't believe they're going to leave. If those millionaires, those wealthier New Jerseyans, do start leaving, you have a revenue problem. So this balancing act between trying to stabilize the public employee pension fund, between roads and bridges, the tunnel into New York City, which the federal government was in favor of and Christie opposed a while back. The bottom line to all these huge money projects is if you tax your way into it, and by getting the money, you run the risk of those who have the most money leaving the state and establishing residence in Florida, which is very common in New Jersey. Complicated stuff.
New Jersey's next governor with Steve Adubato is the special. Other than the interviews, was there anything else that you brought to the table that you thought would be useful in trying to let voters know who they ought to vote for?
You know, it's interesting when you watch these candidates in their public appearances, and Tim, you've been watching this for a long time. You watch them in their appearances; they're very well crafted. You know, all the staging, the whole bit, the imagery, and then you look at their 30-second spots. You find out absolutely nothing as far as I'm concerned. You press a candidate on a question or an issue, and they give you a BS response, and you follow up and say, well, tell me how you're going to do that. How are you going to pay for that? Where's that coming from? What would you cut? And then I would say this to voters. When you watch this on PBS, you know, it's on several PBS stations tomorrow night, the question becomes, do you buy their answers? Do you truly believe that they've thought through how they're going to do these things, or are they trying to repeat their 30-second sound bites or their commercial spots in a half-hour interview? It's much harder to do that when folks like us are trying to press them for real answers.
And I'm sure you're trying to do a judicious editing job, making sure that you're not trying to favor one candidate or the other. But one thing usually happens in these is one comes across typically better through the big screen, if you will, or the small screen. And sometimes somebody comes across and actually gets into the living room, if you know what I mean. Who do you think comes across better on television in that kind of an environment?
And one of the things we learned at PBS is you never interject. And I know what my contract says as a moderator. Don't ever act like a commentator, meaning do not comment on your perception of who came off better. But I'm going to say this. People will decide for themselves. Both of them are engaging, personable, but when it comes to the issues, boy, do they see the world differently. But Donald Trump is not popular in New Jersey, even though he has a pretty nice golf course that I refuse to play on.
All right. Steve, I wonder also, have you heard, and this is not part of your special, but is either candidate bringing in surrogates? Is anyone bringing out the big guns to make this happen? I would think the Democrats are not spending a lot of money because they think this is sewn up already. But I wonder, any high-profile Democrats, any high-profile Republicans who are campaigning for Kim Guadagno?
First of all, for the lieutenant governor, you do not see a lot of high-profile Republicans. And I don't think in fact, I'm confident she does not want the president in the state. Governor
maybe Bob Corker.
Yeah, maybe Bob Corker, right? But I'll say this. The governor has not been particularly engaged in this race. He really hasn't. I'm not sure what that relationship really is between the governor and the lieutenant governor. I think it's testy. But I'll also say this. In terms of the Democrats, I do think they're going to bring in Barack Obama. They may bring in Bill Clinton, possibly Hillary Clinton. Don't think they need it because I do think that Phil Murphy has got a big edge here. But you never know. If this thing gets tighter, the big guns may come in. But the GOP nationally has refused to, in fact, give any real money to Lieutenant Governor's campaign. The Republican Governors Association, unless I'm wrong on this, and I don't think I am, they're not giving her money, and that's not a good sign.
Is the Bob Menendez trial at all playing into this, and would Cory Booker be a good surrogate for Phil Murphy?
Cory Booker is one of those folks in public life who does not have a lot of enemies. I haven't figured out, and I respect Corey a lot, and I've interviewed him many times. He just appeals to lots of different folks. He is a great surrogate, even though he's a New Jersey-based person, former mayor of my hometown, Newark, New Jersey. He's clearly a national figure. He would be, and is very close. He would be a good surrogate and very close to Murphy on this. The Menendez case, basically, Guadagno was saying to Murphy, should he, if in fact he is convicted, should he resign? I'm pressing him to resign right now. That's Guadagno's campaign message. It hasn't seemed to resonate so far because people are trying to follow the facts of this case, and it's premature.
So I guess the other question would be if Democrats do wind up winning this, and are they prepared to take on those kinds of issues? Because that, it seems to me, is something that's going to be very difficult to this is a tough challenge for whoever winds up being in charge of New Jersey.
To your point, Tim, running for office versus serving in office, and clearly Donald Trump is learning the difference. I'm not saying it's easy to get elected, but easier, clearly, to get elected than to govern. To deal with the property tax crisis in New Jersey, number one in the nation for highest property taxes, to deal with this public employee pension crisis, to deal with roads and bridges collapsing, falling apart, which is a dangerous thing. State funding to public schools. I mean, public school crisis has been going on for a long time in terms of where the money would come from and whether urban districts should continue to get more money if, in fact, those kids are not learning as they should. All kinds of issues. I always ask myself, do you really want this job? And in that interview, I do ask Ambassador Murphy and the Lieutenant Governor, tell me why you really want this job and how prepared you are to take on these challenges. It ain't easy, and you're going to frankly get a lot of people peeved whatever you do, but you've got to make tough decisions. And anyone who thinks they can punt on this or pontificate, that's not going to solve any problems. Hard choices and, frankly, getting people pissed is going to really be the answer.
Steve Adubato, I have one last question, and this goes into an opinion in a way, but it's more analysis, okay? Sure. And it's not about, having to pick one side or the other. What happened to Chris Christie, I guess, is my question. This is a guy who probably could have run for president in 2012 and had the Republican nomination. Of course, Sandy hit, and I'm not sure how that would have complicated things, but he was riding high. After that, it just was the biggest drop ever. And obviously, when he ran in 2016, he was out-trumped by Donald Trump. But even at home, he was already having problems. So explain to people what happened to this guy who it seemed was the sort of future Republican, a guy who could win in a blue state and was still popular when the 2012 election came around.
Yeah. The last interview I did with Chris Christie when he was really riding high. Really riding high. And I've interviewed him many times, and I consider on some level, I don't like calling someone a friend, but we are friendly. But I will say Bridgegate and the way that was handled, quote, mishandled, botched, the absurdity of that situation and the perception that the governor or the governor's people were engaged in a situation where people were sitting on that bridge and traffic was stopped on that bridge for political purposes, for retribution against a small-town mayor at Fort Lee, New Jersey, who was a Democrat, and they wanted his endorsement because they wanted, allegedly, for Christie to appear to have, I know it sounds convoluted, but to get Democratic support, which would potentially help him nationally. I mean, I'm not sure what the governor did or didn't do, knew or what he didn't know, but I'll say this. His people at a very high level did some pretty terrible things, and it was very hard for Chris Christie to recover from that at a time when Donald Trump was throwing out some awfully red meat, and it looked like there was no other place for Christie in this race. He just got edged out, and Bridgegate was a killer for him.
Because I was reminded during the campaign when he made that really emotional plea about drugs and about opioid addiction. And I was like, wow, this is just a reminder of how engaging he can be. And by the way, I never thought that his sort of in-your-face attitude was a detriment in New Jersey. I lived in New Jersey when I was a kid, okay? I grew up I went to high school in New York, but I grew up in Kendall Park between Princeton and New Brunswick. So I remember Chris Christie was like half the people I worked with and knew when I was going to school. So it didn't really strike me. It may have been probably more difficult to translate that into a national audience, but that engagement, that sort of understanding, that ability. And by the way, as you mentioned, after that first Bridgegate news conference, he was up there for like an hour and a half taking questions. This guy doesn't mind going in front of the press, but something else happened and it just went away. It's one of the most fascinating political stories. Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting, but let me just say this. Christie, to me, is 10 times more engaging than Donald Trump. 10 times more effective in terms of dealing with the media, more nuanced, more sophisticated, and frankly funnier and a fun guy to be around. But the reality is this. When Trump was saying those horrific things during the Republican primary with 16 candidates and figuring out where his voter bloc was, Chris Christie, to his credit, was not going to try to out-Trump Trump, meaning he didn't believe those same damn things. He didn't believe the stuff when he started out with the Mexican stuff. I know Christie. He was disgusted by that, but he couldn't figure out how to, because no one thought Trump was going to win. He couldn't figure out how to go after Trump, but still be in a position to, quote, get Trump's voters. So I think it was a conundrum for him he could not figure out. And I don't think anyone, including Trump, ever thought he would get the nomination. And I'm convinced that they had a relationship. It went bad after that, but in the end, I think Trump had enough of that block of the Republican constituency to win that primary, and God knows what happened in the general.
Yeah, well, he sort of cleared the way by getting rid of Marco Rubio. That was one.
Chris Christie will take your knees out. I'll just say that. That's a Jersey thing.
Yeah, it is indeed. Well, anyway, the new next governor will be featured tomorrow night, right? Tomorrow night is the show? That's
right, 8 p.m. on PBS stations, NJTV, which is the PBS station in New Jersey, WHYY, which is Philly, South Jersey. C-SPAN's been running it, and I just can't thank you enough for bringing this show to a national audience.
No, it's great, and it's one of those key races. We always say there's nothing going on in the off years, but New Jersey and Virginia have two important gubernatorial races as well as some state races. Steve, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for coming on.
Pleasure's mine. All the best, Tim.
Thank you, Steve Adubato. Again, Emmy-winning broadcaster on the PBS flagship. He mentioned NJTV, WNET. The show tomorrow night, though, at 8 o'clock, as he said, New Jersey's next governor with Steve Adubato, and it features the gubernatorial candidates, Lieutenant Governor Kim Godano, she's the Republican, and former Ambassador Phil Murphy, the Democrat. If you'd like to tweet at Steve, please do, at Steve Adubato, at Steve, Adubato.